What happens when one unexpected question on a live daytime talk show transforms an ordinary celebrity interview into a moment that leaves an entire studio silent, the audience frozen, and millions of viewers convinced they are witnessing television history unfold before their eyes? Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Prime Spotlight, and don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. The lights inside the studio glowed with their usual warmth as the audience settled into their seats, chatting excitedly while cameras quietly moved into position. Every person in the room knew they were about to witness another lively conversation, but no one imagined that the atmosphere would soon shift into something far more intense. The applause swelled as Benedict Cumberbatch stepped onto the stage with his familiar calm smile. Dressed in a sharp navy suit, he greeted the audience with a polite wave before taking his seat. Across from him sat Whoopi Goldberg and the rest of the panel, each welcoming him with friendly conversation. At first, everything unfolded exactly as viewers would expect. The discussion centered around Benedict's newest project, his preparation for demanding roles, and the experiences that had shaped his long career. He answered thoughtfully, occasionally making the audience laugh with his dry sense of humor. "So," Whoopi said with a smile, "you've played brilliant detectives, powerful magicians, historical figures. Does it ever become difficult separating yourself from those characters?" Benedict chuckled. "I think every actor hopes they can leave the character at work." The audience laughed. "But sometimes," he continued, "certain stories stay with you longer than expected." There was nothing unusual. Not yet. The conversation continued through stories about filmmaking, travel, and memorable moments on set. The audience relaxed. Even the host seemed unusually comfortable, exchanging jokes that kept the energy light. Then everything changed. Whoopi leaned slightly forward. "You've always carried yourself with incredible confidence," she began. "Some people say that confidence can occasionally come across as distant." The audience became noticeably quieter. Benedict smiled politely. "I've heard that before. Does it bother you?" He considered the question carefully. "Not particularly." Whoopi nodded. "But do you understand why some people might feel that way?" There was no tension in her voice, only curiosity. Yet something about the question lingered in the air. Benedict folded his hands together before answering. "I think confidence is often interpreted differently depending on who's observing it." "So you're saying people misunderstand you?" "I'm saying assumptions can sometimes become louder than reality." Several audience members nodded. The discussion could have ended there. Instead, another question followed. "Do you ever feel people avoid challenging you because of the reputation you've built?" A few surprised murmurs echoed across the studio. Benedict remained composed. "I actually welcome disagreement." Whoopi smiled. "Really? Absolutely. So if someone challenged your perspective right now, I'd probably thank them." The audience laughed. Whoopi tilted her head. "Careful. More laughter. You may regret saying that." Benedict smiled. "I doubt it." The atmosphere suddenly felt different. Not hostile, just sharper. The conversation shifted away from acting and toward public life. Whoopi observed, "People with large platforms sometimes influence discussions beyond entertainment." "They certainly can," Benedict replied. "Do you think celebrities have a responsibility to speak on important issues?" "I think they have a responsibility to think carefully before speaking." "So not everyone should speak?" "I didn't say that. You implied it." "I don't believe I did." The audience exchanged curious glances. The discussion remained respectful, but every sentence seemed to carry more weight than the one before it. One host attempted to lighten the mood. "Maybe we're overthinking this." The audience laughed again, but the tension never fully disappeared. Whoopi looked directly at Benedict. "You choose your words very carefully." "I try to." "Because you're cautious?" "Because words matter." The room grew quieter once more. "And yet," she continued, "carefully chosen words can sometimes avoid difficult truths." Benedict paused, long enough for everyone to notice. "I'd argue," he finally answered, "that carefully chosen words are often the best way to reach difficult truths." The audience responded with gentle applause. Whoopi acknowledged it with a smile. "Fair point." For a moment, everything seemed to settle. Then a producer signaled that they still had several minutes before the commercial break. Whoopi glanced at her notes. "I've got one more question." The audience leaned forward almost instinctively. Benedict nodded. "Go ahead." She smiled politely. "You've built a reputation for staying calm in nearly every interview." "I try. But has there ever been a moment where you genuinely wanted to stop an interview?" The studio became completely silent. Benedict looked toward the audience before returning his attention to the panel. There have been moments where I believed conversations stopped being conversations. And became what? Competitions. The audience reacted with a low murmur. Whoopi crossed her arms thoughtfully. That's an interesting distinction. I think interviews work best when both people are trying to understand each other. And when they aren't, someone usually starts performing instead of listening. The words hung in the air. Nobody interrupted. Nobody laughed. Even the audience seemed uncertain how to react. Whoopi smiled politely, though her expression had become noticeably more serious. So you're saying interviews sometimes become performances. I'm saying conversations become less meaningful when winning becomes more important than understanding. The applause that followed was hesitant, but genuine. The cameras captured audience members exchanging surprised looks. One producer quietly whispered something through an earpiece. Another checked the countdown clock. The commercial break was approaching. Yet no one in the room seemed eager for the conversation to end. Instead, it felt as though everyone sensed that the real story was only beginning. As the stage lights reflected across the studio floor and the cameras slowly zoomed in for one final shot before the break, Benedict sat calmly in his chair, composed and thoughtful. Across from him, Whoopi looked back with the same steady focus. Neither appeared angry. Neither appeared intimidated. But both clearly understood that the next exchange could change the tone of the entire interview. The audience waited. The hosts waited. Even the production crew seemed unusually still. Then the countdown reached 5 seconds before the cameras would return from the break. Whoopi quietly placed her note cards on the table. She looked directly at Benedict. I think, she said evenly, we should continue this. Benedict nodded once. So do I. The red camera light turned back on. And the conversation was only getting started. The bright red camera light blinked on again, and within an instant the familiar applause returned. Yet the energy in the studio had changed completely. The smiles that had filled the room only moments earlier now carried an unmistakable sense of anticipation. Even viewers watching from home could sense that something different was unfolding. Whoopi Goldberg leaned forward slightly, maintaining the same composed expression she had worn throughout the interview. So, she said calmly, before the break, you mentioned that interviews sometimes stop being conversations and start becoming competitions. Benedict Cumberbatch nodded. I did. I'm curious, Whoopi continued. Have you experienced that often? He paused just long enough to gather his thoughts. Enough times to recognize when it happens. The audience remained silent. What gives it away? She asked. The moment someone becomes more interested in proving a point than discovering one. Several audience members exchanged glances. Whoopi smiled politely. And you're suggesting that's happened to you? I'm suggesting it's happened to many people. She folded her hands together. Fair answer. For a brief moment, the atmosphere softened again. Joy Behar laughed quietly. You two are fencing with words. The audience chuckled. Benedict smiled. I've always preferred conversation to combat. Then let's keep it that way, Joy replied. Everyone laughed. But the tension never completely disappeared. Whoopi picked up another card from the table. You've often spoken about thoughtful dialogue. Yet some critics say celebrities sometimes avoid direct answers by making everything sound philosophical. The audience murmured softly. Benedict's expression remained calm. I understand why people feel that way. So are you avoiding direct answers today? No. Then answer directly. He nodded. I'll do my best. Whoopi looked directly into his eyes. Do you believe television interviews today encourage honest discussion? The question landed heavily. Benedict leaned back in his chair before answering. I think some do. And others? Others reward conflict. The room became noticeably quieter. You mean conflict gets ratings? I think everyone understands that dramatic moments attract attention. A few members of the audience applauded. Whoopi acknowledged them with a glance. So audiences are partly responsible? I didn't say responsible. What did you say? I said attention naturally follows drama. She nodded slowly. And yet, here we are. Benedict smiled. Exactly. The audience laughed again. For a second, even Whoopi laughed. Then she became serious once more. Let's make this personal. The laughter faded immediately. Have you ever felt misunderstood because of something said during an interview? Benedict answered without hesitation. Yes. What happened? One sentence became the headline. And the hour-long conversation disappeared. Several audience members nodded. I think many public figures experience that. Whoopi listened carefully. So you're saying context matters. More than people realize. But headlines don't have room for context. That's true. So whose responsibility is that? The people creating them. And the people clicking them? He smiled slightly. Perhaps everyone shares a little responsibility. The audience applauded louder this time. Joy leaned toward Whoopi. I don't think he's giving us many easy openings. Whoopi laughed. No, he isn't. The atmosphere relaxed for only a moment. Then Whoopi asked another question. Have you ever walked into an interview expecting conflict? Benedict considered it. No. You've never prepared for confrontation? I prepare for conversation. But surely you know some interviews become difficult. Of course. So why walk into them? Because avoiding conversation solves very little. The audience applauded again. One producer standing behind the cameras quietly motioned for everyone to keep the pace steady. The discussion was becoming one of the day's strongest segments. Whoopi glanced briefly toward the audience before returning her attention to Benedict. Let's imagine something. He nodded. Suppose someone believes you're being deliberately evasive. I'd ask why. They answer that every difficult question becomes another carefully constructed speech. Benedict smiled politely. I'd tell them careful thinking isn't the same as avoiding. And if they still disagreed, I'd listen. Whoopi tilted her head. For how long? As long as they're listening too. The audience erupted into applause. Some stood briefly before sitting again. Even the production crew looked impressed by how measured the exchange remained despite its intensity. Whoopi waited for the applause to settle. You know, she smiled thoughtfully. Most guests either become defensive or try to charm their way out of uncomfortable questions. And you're disappointed I haven't done either? Laughter swept across the studio. No, she smiled. I'm surprised. Benedict nodded respectfully. I appreciate that. Another pause settled across the table. This one felt different. Less confrontational. More reflective. Then Whoopi asked the question that instantly shifted the room once again. Do you think people are afraid to disagree with famous actors? The audience fell completely silent. No, Benedict answered. I think people are sometimes encouraged to disagree before they've listened. Whoopi's eyebrows lifted slightly. That's an interesting distinction. I believe disagreement is healthy. So do I. But disagreement without curiosity. He stopped. Usually becomes noise. The words echoed through the studio. No applause. No laughter. Just silence. Even the camera operators remained motionless. Whoopi looked at him carefully. You've clearly thought about this. I've had plenty of opportunities. She nodded. I imagine you have. Another producer signaled that they had only a few minutes remaining before the next scheduled segment. Still, nobody seemed eager to move on. The audience had become completely absorbed. Whoopi slowly placed her note cards back onto the table. I'll admit something. Benedict waited. When this interview started, she smiled. I expected to challenge your opinions. And you challenged the questions instead. A ripple of surprised laughter spread through the audience. Benedict answered gently. I hope I challenged the assumptions. Whoopi leaned back in her chair. Fair enough. The audience applauded once more. Yet before anyone could fully relax, one of the producers stepped closer to the stage and quietly spoke to the hosts during what viewers at home could barely notice as a brief transition. Whoopi listened, nodded once, and then looked back toward Benedict. We've been told we have a little more time. The audience cheered. She smiled. So let's ask the question everyone backstage suddenly wants answered. Benedict raised an eyebrow with quiet curiosity. What question is that? Whoopi met his gaze without looking away. Have either of us changed the other's mind today? She paused just long enough for the entire studio to hold its breath. Or have we simply become better at defending our own? The silence that followed felt even heavier than before. Benedict drew a slow breath. A thoughtful smile appeared across his face. He leaned slightly forward. I think, before he could finish, the program cut unexpectedly to another commercial break, leaving both the studio audience and viewers at home wondering what his answer would be, and whether the most dramatic part of the conversation was still waiting on the other side of the cameras. The studio returned from commercial with a noticeably different energy. The applause was still there, but it was softer now, replaced by an unmistakable feeling of anticipation. The conversation had become the centerpiece of the show, and everyone in the room seemed aware of it. Camera operators adjusted their angles with unusual care. Producers exchanged quiet glances from behind the monitors, and the audience leaned forward almost in unison as the red light signaled they were live once again. Benedict Cumberbatch sat exactly as he had before the break, composed and attentive. Across from him, Whoopi Goldberg offered a small smile. "Before we went to commercial," she began, "I asked whether either of us had actually changed the other's mind today." Benedict nodded. "And I was just about to answer." The audience chuckled. "So," Whoopi said, "go ahead." He took a measured breath before speaking. "I don't think meaningful conversations are measured by who changes someone's mind in 30 minutes. The audience listened in complete silence. "I think they're measured by whether people leave asking better questions than the ones they arrived with." A wave of applause spread through the studio. Whoopi smiled, waiting until it faded. "So, you're saying the goal isn't agreement. The goal is understanding. And if understanding never leads to agreement, then we've still accomplished something valuable." Joy Behar nodded thoughtfully. "I wish more debates worked like that." The audience laughed softly. Whoopi rested one hand on the table. "That's an admirable philosophy." Benedict smiled. "It's also a difficult one." "Why?" "Because patience rarely becomes tomorrow's headline." The audience responded with another round of applause. Whoopi looked toward the crowd. "They certainly liked that answer. I'm grateful they listened." For a brief moment, the atmosphere relaxed. It almost felt as though the interview had found its balance again. Then Whoopi asked a question that shifted everything. "You've spent years playing characters who stand their ground when challenged." "I have. Today you've done the same. I've simply answered your questions. Some people would say you've pushed back every step of the way." Benedict considered her words. "I'd describe it differently." "How?" "I think there's a difference between pushing back and pushing for clarity." The audience murmured in approval. Whoopi leaned forward. "So let's seek clarity." He nodded. "You've mentioned assumptions several times today." "I have. Do you think I came into this interview with assumptions about you?" The room became so quiet that even the faint hum of the studio lights seemed louder. Benedict answered carefully. "I don't know what assumptions you carried, but you suspect I had some. I suspect we all do." She held his gaze. "Including you?" "Including me." That answer surprised the audience. Whoopi noticed it immediately. "So you're admitting you made assumptions about us before you walked out here." "I'd be dishonest if I claimed otherwise." "And were you right?" He smiled faintly. "Some were challenged." A few audience members applauded. "Which ones?" Whoopi asked. "I expected this conversation to become louder." She raised an eyebrow. "And?" It became deeper. The audience broke into louder applause. Even several members of the production crew smiled. Whoopi laughed quietly. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is." Joy leaned toward Benedict. "You know, you're making this very difficult." "Am I?" "I keep expecting an argument." Benedict laughed softly. "So do half the people watching." The audience erupted with laughter. Whoopi couldn't help smiling. "Fair enough." She glanced briefly at the monitor displaying live audience reactions from social media. Her expression shifted. "Interesting. What is it?" Benedict asked. "The producers are showing me comments already coming in." The audience leaned forward. She read one aloud. "This is the calmest intense interview I've ever watched." The crowd laughed. Another comment appeared. "Nobody's yelling, but I can't look away." Even Benedict laughed. "That's quite flattering." Whoopi nodded. "It is." Then another message appeared. She read it more slowly. "This isn't about winning anymore. It's about respect." For the first time since the interview had begun, nobody spoke immediately afterward. The words lingered. Whoopi placed the tablet back on the desk. "Do you know why I wanted you on the show today?" "I assumed it was to talk about my film." She smiled. "That was part of it. And the other part? I've watched dozens of your interviews." Benedict listened quietly. "You always remain composed." "I try." "I wanted to know if there was ever a point where composure became frustration." The audience watched closely. Benedict thought for several seconds. "There is." "When?" "When people stop listening because they've already decided what the answer should be." The applause that followed was immediate. Whoopi waited. "So today." She paused. "Did you ever reach that point?" The audience collectively held its breath. Benedict looked around the studio before answering. "No." The room relaxed almost instantly. "No," she repeated. "No." "Why not?" "Because despite some difficult questions." He smiled politely. "I always believed you were listening." The audience burst into sustained applause. Several people rose to their feet. Whoopi looked genuinely surprised. She shook her head with a smile. I didn't expect that answer. I suspect many people didn't. The applause continued. When it finally settled, Whoopi folded her note cards and set them aside. No more prepared questions. The audience reacted with curiosity. I'd rather ask you something honestly. Please. She looked directly at him. Do interviews like this still matter? He answered almost immediately. Yes. Even in a world where people form opinions from 30-second clips? Especially then. Why? Because conversations remind people that human beings are more complicated than headlines. The audience applauded once again. The producer behind camera, too, quietly counted down the final minutes of the segment. Everyone knew they were approaching the end. Whoopi glanced toward the audience. I think we've surprised each other today. I think we have. She smiled. I challenged you. You did. You challenged me. I hope respectfully. I believe you did. The atmosphere had transformed completely from where it began. The tension remained, but it no longer felt confrontational. Instead, it carried the weight of mutual respect. Just as the audience began to settle into that realization, a stage assistant hurried quietly toward the producers, whispering something urgent. Expressions changed behind the cameras. One producer looked at a monitor. Another reached for a headset. Whoopi noticed immediately. She turned slightly. Everything all right? The producer nodded. Then he whispered one sentence that neither the audience nor viewers at home could fully hear. Whoopi's eyes widened ever so slightly. She looked back toward Benedict. It seems. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Our conversation has already become much bigger than this studio. The audience exchanged confused glances. Phones throughout the production area were lighting up almost simultaneously. News alerts, social media posts, television commentators reacting in real time. Something was happening beyond the walls of the studio, and judging by the expressions behind the cameras, the interview had already begun taking on a life of its own. Neither Benedict nor Whoopi knew exactly how far the discussion had traveled, but they both understood one thing. The final minutes of the show, and everything that happened afterward, would determine how this extraordinary encounter would ultimately be remembered. The final segment began with a sense of anticipation unlike anything the studio audience had experienced that morning. The applause was warm, but it quickly faded into attentive silence. Behind the cameras, producers continued checking phones and monitors as new reactions appeared almost by the second. Whatever had started as a thoughtful interview had grown into the topic everyone backstage was discussing. Whoopi Goldberg looked across the table at Benedict Cumberbatch with a thoughtful expression. It seems, she said, our conversation has reached people faster than any of us expected. Benedict gave a small nod. That tends to happen when people care about the subject. She smiled. Or when they think they're watching a confrontation. The audience laughed softly. Perhaps, Benedict replied. Although I'd rather they remember it as a conversation. Whoopi leaned back in her chair. You know, television has changed over the years. It has. People often expect louder voices, sharper arguments, bigger reactions. And sometimes they receive them. But today, she paused. Today was different. The audience applauded. Joy Behar smiled as she looked from one guest to the other. I have to admit, when this discussion began, I thought one of you was eventually going to lose your patience. The audience laughed again. So did I, another host joked. Even Benedict chuckled. I'm glad I disappointed you. The room erupted with laughter. Whoopi laughed as well before becoming serious once more. I don't think anyone expected disagreement without hostility. I don't believe those two things have to go together, Benedict answered. Several audience members nodded. Whoopi folded her hands. Looking back at everything we've discussed today, is there anything you wish you'd answered differently? Benedict thought carefully. No, nothing. Not because I think every answer was perfect. Then why? Because every answer reflected what I honestly believed at that moment. The audience responded with heartfelt applause. Whoopi smiled. Fair enough. A producer quietly approached the edge of the stage and handed one of the hosts a tablet displaying live audience reactions from around the world. Whoopi glanced down before reading a few aloud. Here's one that says, "This wasn't the explosive clash I expected. It was something even better. Two people standing their ground without losing respect for each other." The audience applauded. She continued. Another viewer writes, "This is proof that disagreement doesn't require shouting." More applause followed. Joy looked toward Benedict. I think you've started quite a conversation online. Benedict smiled modestly. I hope the conversation continues after today's show. Whoopi nodded. So do I. She looked toward the audience. One thing this program has always encouraged is discussion. Benedict agreed. And discussion becomes stronger when people feel comfortable asking difficult questions. Even uncomfortable ones? Especially uncomfortable ones. The audience applauded once again. As the final minutes approached, the studio atmosphere became surprisingly reflective. The tension that had filled the room earlier had transformed into something quieter. An appreciation that two strong personalities had challenged one another without letting the exchange descend into personal attacks. One of the producers signaled that they had less than 2 minutes remaining. Whoopi noticed immediately. I suppose we should wrap this up. Benedict nodded. I suppose we should. She smiled warmly. I'll ask you one last question. Go ahead. When people watch this interview years from now, what do you hope they'll remember? The studio fell silent. Benedict looked around the room, taking in the audience, the hosts, the cameras, and the crew members who had spent the last hour watching every word. Finally, he answered, I hope they remember that listening isn't weakness. The audience remained completely still. I hope they remember that disagreeing with someone doesn't make them an enemy. Several people began applauding. And I hope they remember that conversations become meaningful when people care more about understanding than applause. By the time he finished speaking, the entire audience was on its feet. The standing ovation continued for several long moments. Whoopi stood as well, joining the applause before extending her hand across the table. Thank you for being here. Benedict shook her hand. Thank you for the conversation. The audience applauded even louder. The cameras slowly widened their shot, capturing the hosts, the guest, and the audience together as the show's familiar closing music began to play. But the story didn't end when the broadcast did. Within minutes, short clips from the interview spread across social media platforms. Some viewers described it as one of the most thoughtful celebrity interviews they'd seen in years. Others debated individual quotes, sharing their favorite moments and discussing the exchange from every possible angle. Entertainment commentators released reaction videos, podcasts devoted special segments to the discussion, and countless viewers continued the conversation online, each bringing a different perspective. Some argued that Benedict's calm responses demonstrated remarkable composure under pressure. Others praised Whoopi for asking challenging questions that encouraged deeper discussion rather than simple promotional answers. Many agreed that the interview stood out because neither participant abandoned respect, even when their viewpoints differed. For days afterward, headlines reflected the unexpected impact of the television exchange. Articles, opinion pieces, and online discussions focused less on who had won, and more on why the conversation had resonated with so many viewers. In an era often dominated by quick reactions and viral moments, people found themselves talking about patience, listening, and thoughtful disagreement. Long after the studio lights dimmed and the audience had gone home, the image of two people sitting across from one another, challenging ideas without losing composure, remained the lasting impression. What began as an ordinary interview had evolved into a memorable story, not because of shouting or spectacle, but because both participants refused to let disagreement erase respect. And perhaps that was the biggest surprise of all. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Who do you think made the stronger points during this imagined conversation? Benedict Cumberbatch or Whoopi Goldberg? Share your opinion in the comments below. ***. And if you want more celebrity stories, unexpected interviews, and dramatic narratives, be sure to subscribe to Prime Spotlight, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.